Sometimes, the most unlikely person becomes your salvation when death comes calling. In the unforgiving Texas desert, two young rangers are about to learn this truth the hard way. A flash flood tears through the canyon, sweeping away their horses and supplies. The rangers cling to rocks as the water rises, knowing they're hours from dying in this remote wasteland. What they don't know is that someone is watching from the shadows, a man everyone believes died 20 years ago. Red Jack. Hollister was the most wanted outlaw in 3 territories before he vanished. Now he lives alone with his old dog Boone in a hidden cave. Every instinct tells him to let these lawmen die, but when he sees them struggling, something stirs in his weathered heart. He makes a choice that will change all their lives forever. What happens when an outlaw saves the very men sworn to capture him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged landscape of West Texas, painting the canyon walls in shades of rust and gold. In a hidden cave carved deep into the limestone cliffs, a man who had been dead to the world for 20 years sat with his weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. Steam rising in the cool desert air, John Red Jack Hollister had not spoken his real name aloud in 2 decades. To himself, he was simply Jack now, a hermit who lived in perfect solitude with his faithful companion, a grizzled cattle dog named Boone. The dog lay stretched beside the small campfire, his grey muzzle resting on crossed paws, one brown eye watching Jack with the patience that comes from years of shared silence. Jack reached for the worn leather journal that never left his side, its pages yellowed and soft from constant handling. The cover bore no markings, but inside lay 20 years of solitary thoughts, sketches of Boone in various poses, and memories he had tried to bury but could never quite forget. He opened to a fresh page and began to write as he did each morning, recording the simple observations that marked his days. June 15th. Saw a red-tailed hawk take a prairie dog near the waterhole. Boone wanted to chase, but his old bones kept him close to the fire. Mine too, I suppose. The cave system had been his home since the day he staged his own death in a rock slide near El Paso. 3 separate cave chambers connected by narrow passages provided shelter, storage, and a perfect vantage point overlooking the canyon approaches. He had furnished his refuge with simple necessities accumulated over the years: a bedroll, cooking supplies, tools for minor repairs, and shelves lined with books traded from distant settlements where no one knew his face. The main chamber faced east, catching the morning light through a natural opening camouflaged by desert brush. Jack had positioned his simple furniture to take advantage of this light: a handmade table where he took his meals, a comfortable chair fashioned from salvaged materials, and the wooden chest where he kept his most precious possessions. The journal was one. His memories of the time before were others he preferred to leave buried. Boone stirred and lifted his head, ears perked toward the canyon mouth. The dog had been a pup when Jack found him, barely weaned and abandoned near a dried creek bed. Now 12 years old, Boone's coat had turned silver around his muzzle, and arthritis slowed his gait, but his loyalty remained absolute. In all their years together, the dog had never failed to alert Jack to approaching danger. "What is it, old friend?" Jack whispered, setting down his journal and moving to the cave opening. Through the morning haze, he could see dust rising from the canyon floor, riders approaching fast. Jack reached for the spyglass he kept near the entrance and focused on the movement below. 2 men on horseback, wearing the distinctive badges and hats of Texas Rangers, pushed their mounts hard across the rocky terrain. Even from this distance, Jack could see the urgency in their posture. The younger of the 2 riders had fair hair visible beneath his hat and carried himself with the straight-backed confidence of youth. His companion appeared older, more seasoned, with the weathered look of a man who had spent years in the saddle. Both men bore the unmistakable bearing of lawmen, alert, purposeful, and armed. Jack's chest tightened with familiar anxiety. For 20 years, he had lived with the constant awareness that discovery meant death or imprisonment. He had chosen this remote canyon precisely because few travelers passed through, and those who did rarely ventured far from the main trail. But these rangers were tracking something, following a path that would bring them dangerously close to his sanctuary. As Jack watched, the sky darkened with unnatural speed. Storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, moving toward them with the swift violence that made desert weather so treacherous. The rangers seemed oblivious to the approaching danger, focused entirely on whatever trail they followed. Jack knew these signs. He had lived in this canyon long enough to read the subtle warnings that meant flash flood. The slight change in wind direction, the distant rumble that might be mistaken for thunder but carried a different quality, the way Boone's ears flattened against his head, all indicated that the peaceful morning was about to become deadly. He could warn them. A shout from his position might reach the rangers in time for them to seek higher ground, but warning them would mean revealing his presence, and that was a risk he had never been willing to take. For 20 years, Jack had survived by remaining invisible, by letting the world believe that Red Jack Hollister had died in that rockslide. The storm struck with the sudden fury that characterized desert weather. One moment the canyon lay quiet under morning sun. The next, water crashed down the narrow passages with the force of a freight train. Jack pressed himself against the cave wall and watched in horror as the flood swept through the canyon floor, carrying everything in its path, rocks, debris, and the two rangers who had been caught completely unprepared. Through the rain and spray, Jack could see the men struggling in the churning water. Their horses had either fled or been swept away. The rangers clung to whatever handholds they could find as the current tried to drag them downstream toward the narrow gorge where the canyon walls closed in. No one who went over those falls ever returned. The younger ranger lost his grip first. Jack watched him disappear beneath the brown water, then surface 20 yards downstream, arms flailing as he fought to stay afloat. His partner tried to reach him, but was forced to concentrate on his own survival as the flood level continued to rise. Jack's hands gripped the stone ledge of his hiding place until his knuckles turned white. Every instinct developed over 20 years of hiding screamed at him to stay concealed. These were lawmen, the very people who had hunted him across 3 territories. If they survived and discovered his identity, his peaceful exile would end in chains or a hangman's noose. But as he watched the younger man disappear again beneath the roiling water, something deeper than survival instinct stirred in Jack's chest. Perhaps it was the simple human recognition of mortality, or the memory of his own desperate moments when death had seemed certain. Perhaps it was just the accumulated weight of 20 years spent in isolation, 20 years without the sound of human voices or the comfort of human connection. Boone whined softly and pressed against Jack's leg, as if sensing his internal struggle. The old dog had always been sensitive to Jack's moods, and now his brown eyes seemed to ask a question that Jack had been avoiding for 2 decades. What kind of man had he become in his solitude? The choice, when it came, felt both inevitable and impossible. Jack grabbed his rope from the cave wall and checked that his knife was secure in his belt. Without allowing himself time to reconsider, he whistled sharply to Boone and began the treacherous descent toward the flooded canyon floor. The climb down the wet rock face tested every muscle in Jack's aging body. At 62, he was no longer the nimble outlaw who had once scaled cliffs to escape pursuing posses. His joints protested the exertion, and more than once his boot slipped on the rain-slicked stone. But desperation lent him strength, and the sound of the ranger's shouts for help drove him forward. By the time Jack reached the flood's edge, both men had been swept further downstream. The older ranger had managed to catch hold of a fallen tree trunk wedged between 2 boulders, but his grip was failing. The younger man was nowhere to be seen. Jack plunged into the surging water without hesitation. The current immediately tried to sweep him away, but years of living in this canyon had taught him to read the water's moods. He angled across the flow, using the current's force to carry him toward the trapped ranger while fighting to maintain control of his direction. The rescue took every ounce of Jack's remaining strength. He reached the older ranger just as the man's grip gave way, wrapping his rope around the lawman's chest and securing them both to the tree trunk. The ranger was unconscious, his face pale beneath a nasty gash on his forehead, but he was breathing. Finding the younger ranger required a desperate search downstream. Jack discovered him caught in debris near the canyon wall, barely conscious and bleeding from multiple cuts. Getting both men to safety meant 2 separate trips, each one a battle against the flood's determination to claim its victims. By the time Jack dragged the second ranger to the relative safety of a rock shelf above the floodline, his own strength was nearly spent. Both lawmen were unconscious, injured, and would die without immediate care. The logical choice was to leave them there and return to his cave, to maintain the fiction of his death and preserve the life he had built in solitude. Instead, Jack hoisted the younger ranger across his shoulders and began the long, painful climb toward his hidden refuge. Boone helped as only a loyal dog could, staying close to Jack's feet to provide balance and encouragement. When Jack returned for the second man, the sun was setting, and his legs shook with exhaustion. In the cave's warm, dry sanctuary, Jack laid both rangers on his own bedroll and began the careful work of keeping them alive. He cleaned their wounds with water heated over his fire, tore strips from his spare clothing to make bandages, and monitored their breathing through the long night. Boone curled up nearby, standing guard with the patient vigilance that had characterized their entire relationship. As dawn broke over the canyon, Jack sat back on his heels and studied the 2 young faces before him. In sleep, they looked even younger than he had thought, barely old enough to wear the badges that marked them as Texas Rangers. The older had dark hair and strong features that seemed familiar, though Jack could not place why. The younger was fair-haired and slender, with the soft look of someone who had not yet been hardened by too much exposure to violence. Jack reached for his journal and opened to a fresh page. For the first time in 20 years, he was not alone. For the first time in 20 years, he faced the possibility that his carefully constructed solitude was about to end. And for the first time in 20 years, he was not entirely certain he minded. The decision to drag 2 unconscious Texas Rangers into his sanctuary felt like madness, even as Jack committed to it. With each labored step up the treacherous rock face, the weight of his choice pressed down on him like the storm clouds that had brought this calamity. 20 years of careful invisibility, of perfectly maintained solitude, now hung in the balance because he could not watch 2 men die. The first ranger, the older one with the dark hair, had taken the worst of the flood's punishment. A deep gash across his forehead continued to seep blood despite Jack's makeshift bandaging, and his breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps that spoke of internal injuries. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and purple bruises bloomed across his ribs where the rushing water had slammed him against the rocks. Jack worked by firelight, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle as he tended wounds that could easily prove fatal without proper medical attention. He had learned battlefield medicine during his outlaw years, not from any formal training, but from the hard necessity of keeping his gang alive when doctors were not an option. Those skills, rusty from disuse, came back to him now with grim familiarity. The younger ranger stirred first, his eyelids fluttering as consciousness returned in fits and starts. Jack positioned himself in the shadows, beyond the fire's glow, watching as the young man struggled to orient himself in the unfamiliar surroundings. When the ranger's eyes finally focused, they were the clear blue of desert sky, bright with intelligence and confusion, where the word came out as a croak, followed by a coughing fit that brought up muddy water from his lungs. "Easy, son." Jack's voice, unused to conversation after years of silence, sounded rougher than he intended. "You're safe. Both of you." The young ranger tried to sit up, winced, and fell back against the bedroll. His gaze swept the cave chamber, taking in the rough stone walls, the modest furnishings, and the fire that cast dancing shadows on the ceiling. "My partner, alive. Hurt bad, but alive." Jack stepped into the light, allowing the ranger to see him clearly for the first time. "Name's John. This is my home." The ranger studied Jack's face with the trained observation of a lawman. Jack knew what he saw. A man in his 60s with sun-weathered skin, grey hair that had not seen a barber in months, and the lean build of someone accustomed to hard living. Nothing about his appearance would immediately suggest his infamous past, but Jack felt exposed nonetheless. "Thomas Brennan," the young ranger said, extending his hand despite his obvious pain. "Texas Rangers. This is my partner, Samuel Hayes." He gestured toward the unconscious man. "We were tracking cattle thieves when the storm hit." The name struck Jack like a physical blow. Brennan. He fought to keep his expression neutral. But inside, memories crashed over him like the flood that had brought these men to his door. Sheriff Marcus Brennan had been Jack's most persistent pursuer, the one lawman who had never given up the hunt, even when others declared Red Jack Hollister dead. For 5 years, Brennan had followed every lead, investigated every rumor, never accepting that his quarry had simply vanished. This young man bore a strong resemblance to the sheriff who had haunted Jack's nightmares. The same strong jaw, the same intelligent eyes, the same bearing that spoke of unwavering moral conviction. If this was Brennan's son, then fate had played a cruel joke, delivering Jack's greatest enemy's offspring directly into his hands. "You saved our lives," Thomas continued, struggling to push himself upright. "The flood came out of nowhere. We lost our horses, our supplies, everything." Jack nodded, not trusting his voice. He moved to check on Samuel Hayes, grateful for the excuse to turn away from Thomas's penetrating gaze. The unconscious ranger's breathing had improved slightly, but he remained deeply unconscious. His injuries were severe enough to require days, perhaps weeks of recovery. "How long have we been here?" Thomas asked. "Through the night. It's morning now, though you wouldn't know it in here." Jack stirred the fire, adding another piece of carefully hoarded wood. "The flood's receded, but there's more weather coming." "You're not going anywhere for a while." Thomas tried again to sit up, this time succeeding despite obvious pain. He wore the standard-issue clothing of a Texas Ranger, dark trousers, cotton shirt, and a vest that bore the distinctive star badge. The badge caught the firelight, and Jack found himself staring at the symbol that had represented everything he had spent his life running from. "We need to get word to our headquarters," Thomas said. "They'll be looking for us." "No one's looking for anybody in this weather," Jack replied. "The nearest town is 30 miles through country that'll be impassable for days. You're hurt, your partner's barely alive, and you've got no horses or supplies. Your only choice is to wait." The words came out harsher than Jack intended, but they were true. The isolation that had protected him for 2 decades now protected these rangers as well. No rescue party would venture into this remote canyon until the weather cleared and they had time to organize a proper search. Thomas seemed to understand the logic, even if he did not like it. He settled back against the cave wall, his gaze moving around the chamber with professional interest. Jack watched him catalog details, the carefully arranged supplies, the evidence of long habitation, the small personal touches that marked this as more than a temporary shelter. "You live here alone?" Thomas asked. "Me and Boone." Jack gestured to the old dog, who had maintained his position near the cave entrance throughout the night. "Been here a long time. Must get lonely." The simple observation hit closer to home than Jack cared to admit. Loneliness had been his constant companion for 20 years, as familiar as the desert wind, and just as persistent. He had told himself it was the price of freedom, the cost of escaping his past. But sitting here with another human being, hearing a voice that was not his own echo off the cave walls, Jack realized how much he had given up in exchange for safety. "A man gets used to quiet," he said. Samuel Hayes chose that moment to regain consciousness, his eyes opening with the sudden alertness of someone accustomed to danger. Unlike his partner, Samuel's first instinct was to reach for his gun, a weapon that was no longer there. "Easy," Jack said, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. "You're among friends." Samuel's gaze darted between Jack and Thomas, assessing the situation with the quick intelligence of an experienced lawman. He was older than Thomas, probably in his 30s, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of years spent outdoors. A thick mustache framed his mouth, and his dark eyes held the hardness that came from seeing too much violence. "Where are we?" Samuel's voice was stronger than his partner's had been, though pain tightened the corners of his eyes. Thomas explained their situation while Jack tended the fire and prepared a simple meal from his stores. Listening to the young ranger's account of their rescue, Jack found himself remembering what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself. The easy camaraderie between the two lawmen, their obvious concern for each other, stirred emotions he had thought buried beneath 20 years of isolation. As the day wore on, Jack found his carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. The ranger's presence filled his sanctuary with something he had not realized he missed: human warmth. Their voices drove away the oppressive silence that had been his only companion for so long. Even their pain and vulnerability reminded him of what it meant to care about someone other than himself. But beneath the unexpected pleasure of their company lay a growing dread. These men wore badges. They had sworn oaths to uphold the law and bring criminals to justice. If they discovered his true identity, their gratitude for the rescue would not override their duty. Red Jack Hollister was worth a substantial bounty, dead or alive, and 20 years of peaceful exile would not erase the crimes that had put that price on his head. In his journal that night, Jack wrote a single line: "Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again." He had made his choice in the moment he descended into that flood. Now he would have to live with the consequences, whatever they might be. For the first time in 20 years, Jack faced an uncertain future, and despite his fear, part of him welcomed the change. 3 days passed in a rhythm that felt both foreign and strangely comforting to Jack. His cave, which had echoed with only his own voice and Boone's occasional barks for 2 decades, now hummed with conversation and the simple sounds of human habitation. The rangers recovered slowly but steadily, their strength returning as their bodies healed from the trauma of the flood. Samuel Hayes proved to be the more cautious of the two, his dark eyes constantly assessing their surroundings and their mysterious rescuer. He spoke little but observed everything, and Jack could feel the weight of his scrutiny during quiet moments. Thomas Brennan, by contrast, possessed an open nature that reminded Jack painfully of his own youth, curious, trusting, and eager to find the good in people. "You mind if I ask what brought you to live out here, John?" Thomas said on the 3rd evening as they shared a meal around the fire. The young ranger had insisted on helping with the cooking despite his injuries, claiming that sitting idle made him restless. Jack paused in his chewing, considering how to answer. The truth was impossible, but he had discovered that lying to these earnest young men felt increasingly difficult. "Sometimes a man needs distance from his past," he said finally. "Bad memories?" Thomas asked with the gentle sympathy of someone who had not yet accumulated enough pain to understand its weight. "Something like that." Samuel looked up from his plate, his expression thoughtful. Man doesn't usually live this far from civilization unless he's running from something. Or someone. The observation hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. Jack met Samuel's gaze steadily, recognizing the probe for what it was. The older ranger suspected something, though he could not yet put his finger on what. "We're all running from something," Jack replied. "Some folks just run farther than others." Thomas shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension, but not understanding its source. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the firelight, his ranger badge, its silver surface scratched, but still bearing the distinctive star that marked him as a Texas lawman. The badge had been crafted with obvious care, its edges beveled and its surface polished to a mirror shine. Thomas turned it over in his hands with the reverence of someone handling a sacred relic, and Jack noticed an inscription on its back: "Brennan to T. Brennan, carry justice with honor." "This was my father's," Thomas said, following Jack's gaze. "He passed it down to me when I joined the Rangers 2 years ago." Jack's chest tightened. Marcus Brennan had been dead for 2 years then. The man who had pursued him with such relentless determination had finally found peace, leaving his badge and his legacy to a son who wore them with pride. He must have been proud, Jack managed. He was a good lawman. Fair but firm. He always said the badge wasn't about power, it was about responsibility. Thomas polished the star with his thumb, a gesture that seemed automatic. He spent his whole career chasing down men who thought they were above the law. Samuel snorted softly. Your daddy ever catches white whale? Thomas looked puzzled. White whale? Red Jack Hollister. That outlaw your father spent half his career hunting. Never could bring him in. Jack forced himself to remain perfectly still, though every muscle in his body wanted to flee. The conversation had taken the exact turn he had dreaded, and now he sat trapped by politeness and the need to maintain his deception. Dad never gave up believing he'd find Red Jack, Thomas said. Said the man was too smart to stay hidden forever. But the trail went cold after that rockslide near El Paso. Most folks figured Jack was dead. What did your father think? Jack asked. Surprised by his own boldness, Thomas was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. He always said a man like Red Jack wouldn't die easy. Too clever, too stubborn. Dad thought he might have staged the whole thing, gone to ground somewhere until the heat died down. The accuracy of the assessment sent a chill down Jack's spine. Even in death, Marcus Brennan continued to haunt him. Tell me about this Red Jack, Samuel said. Before my time with the Rangers. Thomas leaned forward, warming to a subject he had obviously heard discussed many times. Started as small-time cattle rustling, but he was smart about it. Never took enough to break a rancher, never hit the same area twice in a row. Built up a gang of men who were loyal as hounds. Jack found himself listening to his own legend with fascination and no small amount of discomfort. The young ranger's account painted Red Jack as almost a folk hero. Dangerous but honorable, violent but principled. What made him so hard to catch? Samuel asked. He had rules, Thomas continued. Never hurt anyone who didn't try to hurt him first. Never robbed from poor folks. Always left enough supplies for his victims to get home safe. Some people started to romanticize him, said he was like Robin Hood or some such nonsense. Nonsense? Jack found himself asking. Thomas's expression hardened slightly. A criminal is a criminal, no matter how polite he is about it. Red Jack might have had a code, but he still stole property, still cost honest folks their livelihoods. My father always said the worst criminals were the ones who convinced themselves they were doing good. The words stung more than Jack cared to admit. He had indeed told himself that his crimes served a greater purpose, that he was evening the scales in a world where the rich grew richer on the backs of the poor. But sitting here, looking at the earnest face of Marcus Brennan's son, those justifications felt thin and self-serving. Boone chose that moment to pad over to Thomas, settling beside the young ranger with a contented sigh. The dog had taken a particular liking to Thomas, perhaps sensing the young man's gentle nature. Thomas scratched behind Boone's ears, and the dog leaned into the attention with obvious pleasure. Good old boy, Thomas murmured. How long have you had him, John? Found him as a pup 12 years ago, maybe 13. Jack watched his faithful companion enjoy the attention of another human being. He's been good company. Dogs are better than most people, Samuel observed. More honest, anyway. The comment drew a sharp look from Thomas. You're getting cynical in your old age, Sam. Just realistic. Most folks will lie to your face if it serves their purpose. Dog won't do that. Jack felt the weight of Samuel's words, knowing they applied to him more than anyone else in the cave. Here he sat, sharing food and warmth with these decent men, while lying about his very identity. The irony was not lost on him that he was proving Samuel's point about human dishonesty. As the evening wore on, and the rangers prepared for sleep, Jack found himself studying their faces in the dying firelight. Thomas wore his father's badge with obvious pride, carrying forward a legacy of law and order. Samuel, older and more weathered, bore the cynicism that came from years of dealing with human nature's darker aspects. Both men trusted him enough to sleep in his presence. Despite their isolation and vulnerability, that trust felt heavier than any chain, more confining than any prison cell. For 20 years, Jack had believed that freedom meant being answerable to no one. Now he was beginning to understand that true freedom might require something far more difficult: honesty. By the end of the first week, The cave had transformed from Jack's solitary refuge into something approaching a home. The ranger's presence brought routines he had forgotten, shared meals at regular times, conversations that lasted deep into the night, and the simple pleasure of waking to voices other than his own thoughts. Samuel's broken ribs were healing well, though he still moved carefully to avoid aggravating the injury. Thomas had recovered most of his strength, and his natural optimism had begun to shine through despite their circumstances. The young ranger possessed an infectious enthusiasm that reminded Jack of everything he had lost during his years of isolation. "You know what I miss most?" Thomas said one morning as he helped Jack prepare breakfast. "Coffee, real coffee, not this chicory substitute we've been drinking." Jack smiled despite himself. "There's a trading post about 40 miles north. Fellow, there gets real coffee beans sometimes when the supply trains make it through." "You know the area pretty well," Samuel observed from his position by the fire. The older ranger had been making similar comments for days, carefully probing for information about Jack's background. "A man learns his surroundings when his life depends on it," Jack replied. Thomas looked up from the pan he was stirring. "Sounds like you've had some hard times, John." The simple compassion in the young man's voice caught Jack off guard. He had grown accustomed to solitude's emotional numbness, but Thomas's genuine concern threatened to crack the walls he had built around his heart. "Most folks have," Jack said. "You boys included, I'd imagine." "Rangers see their share of trouble," Samuel agreed. "Some more than others." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Sam here has been with the Rangers for 8 years. Seen more action than most." "What brought you to law work?" Jack asked Samuel, genuinely curious about the man who watched him with such careful attention. Samuel was quiet for a moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "My brother was killed by road agents when I was 20. Shot down for the $40 in his pocket." His voice carried the flat tone of old grief. "Figured somebody ought to make sure men like that faced justice." The story hit Jack like a physical blow. How many brothers, fathers, and sons had he orphaned during his outlaw years? He had always told himself that his victims were wealthy men who could afford the loss. But Samuel's words reminded him that every crime rippled outward, touching innocent lives in ways he had never considered. "I'm sorry," Jack said, and meant it. "Long time ago now," Samuel replied, "but it's why I don't have much patience for folks who romanticize outlaws. There's nothing romantic about what they do to ordinary people." Thomas had been listening with obvious discomfort. "Sam's right, of course, but sometimes I wonder if there's more to these stories than we hear. Take Red Jack, for instance. Some of the folks he robbed spoke well of him afterward, probably just grateful to be alive," Samuel said dismissively. "Maybe, but the stories are awfully consistent. He never took more than people could afford to lose, never hurt anyone unnecessarily. There was even that widow near San Antonio who said he left money for her after learning her husband had died." Jack remembered that incident clearly. Maria Santos, a young woman left destitute when her rancher husband was killed in a stampede. Jack had discovered her situation only after robbing what he thought was her husband's cattle shipment. The memory of her tears still haunted him. "You sound like you admire him," Samuel said with a sharp edge to his voice. Thomas flushed. "Not admire exactly, but I think maybe there was more to his story than simple greed." "Every criminal has a sob story," Samuel replied. "Doesn't excuse what they do." The conversation was veering into dangerous territory, but Jack found himself unable to stay silent. What if a man had reasons? Good reasons? Both rangers looked at him with surprise. Jack realized he had spoken with more passion than his carefully maintained persona warranted. "Reasons for what?" Thomas asked. Jack hesitated, then plunged ahead. "For taking what wasn't his. What if the system was rigged against him? What if the law protected men who were worse criminals than he ever was?" Samuel's eyes narrowed. "You talking from experience, John?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Jack felt the weight of both men's attention, saw the suspicion beginning to form in Samuel's weathered features. He had revealed too much, let his emotions override his caution. "I've seen enough of the world to know it's not always fair," Jack said carefully. "Sometimes good men get pushed into bad choices." "The law's the law," Samuel said flatly. "Man doesn't get to pick and choose which parts to follow, even when the law fails him first." The question came out harsher than Jack intended. Samuel's jaw tightened, and Thomas looked between the two older men with growing concern. "That's a dangerous way of thinking," Samuel said. "Start making exceptions, and pretty soon you've got no law at all." Jack wanted to argue, to explain how it felt to watch corrupt officials rob poor families with the protection of their badges while honest men struggled to survive. But explaining would require admitting too much about his own past, and that was a risk he could not take. Boone, sensing the tension in the air, padded over to Jack's side. The old dog had always been sensitive to Jack's moods, and now he pressed against his master's leg in a gesture of comfort and support. Jack reached down to scratch behind Boone's ears, grateful for the distraction. The small carved bone toy that Boone carried everywhere lay at the dog's feet, a simple piece of whittling that Jack had made during their first winter together. The toy bore the marks of years of gentle play, its edges worn smooth by Boone's patient attention. Looking at it now, Jack was reminded of the capacity for tenderness that had somehow survived his violent past. "That's a fine piece of carving," Thomas said, following Jack's gaze to the toy. "You make it?" "Long time ago." Boone was just a pup, needed something to chew on. Thomas picked up the small bone, examining Jack's craftsmanship with obvious appreciation. "You've got skilled hands. This is beautiful work." The simple praise warmed Jack more than it should have. For 20 years, no one had commented on his handiwork. No one had appreciated the small touches that made his cave a home rather than just a hiding place. "Man needs something to keep his hands busy," Jack said. "My father always said you could tell a lot about a man by what he creates," Thomas replied, still studying the carved toy. "This shows patience, care, love even." The word love struck Jack unexpectedly. When had he last felt love for anything beyond his faithful dog? When had anyone used that word to describe something he had made? As evening approached and the Rangers settled in for another night, Jack found himself watching them with new eyes. These were not just the faceless lawmen who had haunted his nightmares for 20 years. They were human beings with their own stories, their own losses, their own struggles to make sense of a complicated world. The realization both comforted and terrified him. If he could see their humanity, they might eventually see his, and that recognition could either save them all or destroy everything he had built in his years of exile. The chess set emerged on the 10th day of their confinement, when evening conversations had grown comfortable enough to span hours, and Thomas had remarked that he missed the mental stimulation of games. Jack had hesitated before retrieving the hand-carved pieces from their place of honor on his bookshelf, knowing that the craftsmanship would reveal more about his character than simple conversation ever could. "You made this yourself?" Samuel asked, examining one of the knights with obvious appreciation. The piece was carved from dark mesquite wood, its flowing lines capturing the essence of a horse in motion with remarkable skill. "Had a lot of time on my hands," Jack replied, though the understatement barely covered 20 years of patient work. The chess set represented hundreds of evenings spent alone, channeling his restless energy into something beautiful and lasting. Thomas lifted the white king, marveling at the intricate details carved into the tiny crown. "This is museum-quality work, John. You could sell pieces like this in any city." "Not much use for money out here," Jack said, though he was pleased by the praise. The chess set was his finest creation, born from loneliness and perfected through countless solitary games against himself. They arranged the board between the fire and Jack's chair, the carved pieces casting dancing shadows on the stone floor. Thomas proved to be an aggressive player, favoring bold attacks and dramatic sacrifices. Samuel, predictably, played a cautious, methodical game that reflected his careful nature. Jack found himself rusty after years without a human opponent, but the old strategies came back quickly. More than the game itself, he enjoyed the conversation that flowed around the moving pieces, the gentle arguments about tactics, the shared appreciation for elegant solutions to complex problems. "Your move, John," Thomas said. Having just sacrificed his queen for what he hoped would be a mating attack, Jack studied the position with the patience that had served him well in more dangerous games. "You know, this reminds me of something an old friend used to say about life. Sometimes you have to lose something valuable to gain something even more precious." "Sounds philosophical," Samuel observed. "Your friend a gambling man?" "In a way. He believed that every choice was a wager. You bet your present situation against the possibility of something better." Jack moved his king to safety, deflecting Thomas's attack. "The trick was knowing when the odds were in your favor." Thomas frowned at the board, seeing his brilliant combination dissolve into a drawn endgame. "What happened to him?" "Your friend." Jack paused, his hand hovering over a pawn. The friend he had referenced was himself. The man he had been before 20 years of isolation had changed him. He took one gamble too many, lost everything that mattered to him. "I'm sorry," Thomas said with genuine sympathy. The conversation turned to other topics as they played. Family histories carefully edited, memories of better times, dreams that transcended their current circumstances. Jack found himself sharing more than he had intended, drawn out by the Rangers' easy camaraderie and their obvious hunger for human connection. "What about you, John?" Samuel asked during their second game. "You ever have family?" The question struck like a knife thrust, precise and unexpected. Jack forced his expression to remain neutral, though his chest tightened with the familiar ache of old grief. "Once," he said simply. Thomas looked up from contemplating his next move. "Wife, children?" "A daughter," the words emerged before Jack could stop them, carrying 20 years of suppressed pain. "Lost her when she was just 5 years old." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither Ranger fully understood. Jack had never spoken of his daughter aloud, not in all his years of exile. Her memory was too precious, too painful to share with anyone. "How?" Samuel asked gently. Jack was quiet for so long that Thomas began to apologize for the intrusion. Finally Jack spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Fever, diphtheria outbreak swept through the territory. Took her in 3 days. He moved a chess piece without looking at the board. "Her mother died bringing her into the world. When the fever took my little girl, I had nothing left." Thomas reached across the board and touched Jack's arm. Briefly, a gesture of comfort from someone young, enough to still believe that human kindness could heal old wounds. "That's a terrible loss," Thomas said. "I can't imagine the pain." "Changes a man," Jack replied. "Makes him question everything he thought he knew about fairness, about justice, about whether there's any point in following rules when the world doesn't seem to follow any itself." Samuel leaned back in his chair, studying Jack with new understanding. "That when you came out here, after losing her?" Jack nodded, grateful that the Ranger had provided him with a plausible timeline for his exile. Couldn't stand being around people anymore. All their sympathy, their empty promises that time would heal the hurt. "Easier to be alone. But you saved us," Thomas pointed out. "That doesn't sound like a man who's given up on people." The observation struck closer to the truth than Jack was comfortable with. Why had he risked everything to save 2 strangers? What had compelled him to break 20 years of perfect isolation for men he should have considered enemies? "Maybe I was just tired of being alone," Jack admitted. They played 3 more games that evening, conversation flowing as easily as if they had known each other for years rather than days. Jack found himself watching the Rangers with growing affection. Thomas with his earnest optimism, Samuel with his hard-won wisdom. Both men possessed qualities Jack had forgotten he valued: integrity, loyalty, the courage to stand for something larger than themselves. As the fire burned low and the Rangers prepared for sleep, Thomas made an observation that would haunt Jack through the long night ahead. "You know, John, I keep thinking my father would have liked you. You remind me of him in some ways. The way you think about right and wrong, the way you see the complexity in things that seem simple to other folks." The irony was devastating. Marcus Brennan would indeed have liked the man Jack had become in his years of exile. But he would have hanged the man Jack had been before his daughter's death. And rightfully so. Jack lay awake long after the ranger's breathing had settled into the rhythms of sleep, staring at the chess set's carved figures in the dying firelight. The game's eternal struggle between order and chaos, strategy and instinct, seemed to mirror his own internal battle. For 20 years, he had believed that survival required him to bury his past completely. But these young men were teaching him that some parts of his old self might be worth preserving, and that the line between criminal and victim was far more complex than he had ever imagined. 2 weeks into their stay, the weather finally cleared enough for the rangers to consider leaving. Jack stood at the cave entrance, watching morning sunlight paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and amber, and tried to ignore the hollow feeling in his chest. For 14 days, he had lived with the constant threat of discovery balanced against the unexpected joy of human companionship. Now both were about to end. "Looks like we'll finally be able to make our way out of here," Thomas said, joining Jack at the cave mouth. The young ranger had recovered fully from his injuries, his natural energy no longer contained by the limitations of healing. The trail down to the main road should be passable now, Jack agreed, though each word felt like a small betrayal. He should be eager to see them go, to return to the safety of solitude. Instead, he found himself searching for reasons to delay their departure. Samuel emerged from the cave's depths, moving more carefully than his partner, but clearly ready to travel. "We need to get word to headquarters about those cattle thieves. The trail's probably cold by now, but we might still pick up their tracks." Jack nodded, understanding their duty even as he dreaded its execution. "I'll guide you to the canyon mouth. Make sure you don't take any wrong turns." "That's kind of you," Thomas said. "We owe you more than we can ever repay." The gratitude in the young man's voice made Jack's deception feel even more shameful. These rangers saw him as their savior, a gruff but kind hermit who had risked his own safety to help strangers in need. They had no idea they were thanking the very man their organization had sworn to capture. As they prepared to leave, Jack found himself moving slowly, taking extra time with each task. He checked their improvised bandages one final time, shared the last of his coffee beans for a farewell breakfast, and even carved a small whistle from a piece of pine for Thomas to remember their time together. "This is beautiful work," Thomas said, examining the whistle. Its surface bore intricate patterns that seemed to dance in the morning light. "You've got a real gift for this. Something to keep your hands busy on long rides," Jack replied. Though the gift felt inadequate compared to what these men had given him, 2 weeks of conversation, laughter, and the reminder that he was still capable of caring about someone other than himself. Samuel had been watching Jack's preparations with his characteristic attention to detail. Throughout their stay, the older ranger had continued to observe and assess, clearly sensing that their host harbored secrets. Now, as they prepared to leave, those observations seemed to coalesce into something approaching suspicion. "John," Samuel said carefully, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Jack's blood chilled, but he kept his expression neutral. "What's that?" "You carry yourself like a man who's spent time around violence. The way you move, the way you watch the horizon, that's not something you learn from living alone with a dog." Thomas looked surprised by his partner's observation, but Jack could see the truth of it reflected in the young ranger's eyes. They had both noticed things during their stay, small details that added up to a picture that did not quite match the story of a simple hermit. "Man learns to be careful out here," Jack said. "Coyotes, rattlesnakes, the occasional drifter looking for trouble." "Maybe," Samuel replied, unconvinced. "But you handle yourself like someone who's been in gunfights. Professional ones." The accusation hung between them like a loaded weapon. Jack felt the weight of his past pressing down on him. 20 years of careful deception threatening to crumble in the face of one ranger's intuition. "We've all got pasts we'd rather not discuss," Jack said finally. Samuel nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But if there's something you need to tell us, something that might put us in danger, now would be the time." Jack looked between the two rangers, seeing the trust in Thomas's face and the wariness in Samuel's. Both men deserved the truth. But the truth would destroy the fragile peace he had built and likely cost him his life. "The only danger you're in is from the men you're hunting," Jack said. "And they're long gone by now." It was not exactly a lie, but it was not the truth either. Jack could see that Samuel was not entirely satisfied with the answer, but the ranger seemed willing to let the matter rest. For now, as they gathered their few remaining possessions, Jack retrieved something from the wooden chest where he kept his most precious belongings. Hidden beneath old newspapers and spare clothing lay a gun belt that had not seen daylight for 20 years. Red Jack's notorious rig, with its ornate silver buckle bearing the initials J.H. Jack stared at the belt for a long moment, remembering the man who had worn it with such pride and arrogance. The leather was still supple, the silver still bright despite the years. The gun itself was a work of art, a Colt .45 with custom grips and a barrel that had been shortened for speed. It was the weapon of a professional gunfighter, distinctive enough that any lawman worth his badge would recognize it immediately. He could destroy it, of course, bury it somewhere in the canyon where it would never be found. But something held him back, perhaps sentiment. Perhaps the recognition that this belt represented not just his criminal past, but also the skills that had kept him alive through decades of danger. In the end, Jack closed the chest without touching the gun belt. Some secrets were too dangerous to risk, no matter how much he longed for the honesty that might bring peace to his tormented conscience. The journey to the canyon mouth took most of the morning, following narrow trails that wound between towering rock formations. Jack led the way, pointing out landmarks and potential hazards while trying to memorize every detail of his companions' faces. After today, he would likely never see them again. Boone trotted alongside the group, his aging legs managing the terrain with difficulty but his spirits high. The old dog seemed to sense that something significant was happening, and he divided his attention between Jack and their departing guests, as if trying to understand why his pack was breaking apart. When they reached the main trail that would take the rangers back to civilization, Jack felt a finality that cut deeper than he had expected. This was where they would part ways, the honorable lawmen returning to their duty, the hidden outlaw retreating to his cave to live with his secrets. "This is as far as I go," Jack said. Stopping at the junction where the narrow canyon trail met the broader road, Thomas dismounted from the horse Jack had helped them catch, one of their original mounts that had wandered back after the flood. The young ranger extended his hand with obvious emotion. "I don't know how to thank you," Thomas said. "You saved our lives, took care of us, asked for nothing in return. That's the mark of a truly good man." The words hit Jack like physical blows. A good man. If only Thomas knew the truth about the good man who had shown them kindness. Samuel's handshake was firmer, more reserved, but no less grateful. "If you ever need anything at all, you get word to the Texas Rangers. We take care of our own, and you're one of ours now." Jack nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. These men were offering him something he had not possessed in 20 years, belonging, acceptance. The knowledge that someone in the world cared whether he lived or died. As the rangers mounted their horses and prepared to ride away, Thomas turned back one final time. "John," he called, "I hope you find whatever peace you're looking for out here." Jack watched them disappear around a bend in the trail, their figures growing smaller until they vanished entirely into the vast Texas landscape. Only then did he allow himself to feel the full weight of his loss. Boone pressed against his leg, whining softly as if he too understood that their brief moment of human connection had ended. Jack reached down to scratch his companion's ears, grateful that at least one relationship in his life was honest and uncomplicated. The walk back to the cave felt longer than the journey out, each step taking him further from the men who had unknowingly given him hope for redemption and back toward the solitary existence that had been his punishment and his protection. That evening, Alone again in his cave, Jack opened his journal to a fresh page and wrote, "Some gifts are too precious to keep and too dangerous to give." 3 days passed in solitude before Thomas Brennan returned, riding hard up the canyon trail with urgency written in every line of his body. Jack watched from his cave entrance as the young ranger approached, Boone barking a welcome beside him. Something had changed in Thomas's demeanor. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a tension that spoke of internal struggle. "John," Thomas called as he dismounted near the cave. "I need to talk to you." Jack emerged from his sanctuary, noting the strain in Thomas's voice and the way the young man's hand rested unconsciously near his gun. "What brings you back?" "Thought you'd be halfway to headquarters by now." "We were. Got 20 miles down the trail before I had to turn around." Thomas's blue eyes were troubled, searching Jack's face for something he could not quite name. "There's something I need to show you." From his saddlebags, Thomas withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn soft at the creases. He handed it to Jack with obvious reluctance. "Found this in my gear. It's a letter my father wrote to me before he died. I'd never read it before. Couldn't bring myself to open it until yesterday." Jack unfolded the paper with hands that trembled slightly. The handwriting was familiar, though he had not seen it in 20 years. Sheriff Marcus Brennan's careful script filled the page with words that seemed to reach across the grave to deliver one final message. "My dear son," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I have passed on without completing the work that defined my career. For 5 years I hunted a man called Red Jack Hollister, and for 5 years he eluded me. In my younger days, I would have called this failure. Now in my final years, I wonder if perhaps it was grace." Jack's chest tightened as he read, remembering the relentless sheriff who had pursued him across 3 territories. Marcus Brennan had been a formidable opponent, intelligent, persistent, and utterly incorruptible. But this letter revealed a side of the man Jack had never suspected. The more I learned about Jack Hollister, the more complicated my feelings became. Yes, he was a criminal who cost honest folks their property. But the circumstances of his fall from grace troubled me. He lost his wife in childbirth, then his daughter to disease. The officials, who should have helped him instead, demanded payment he could not make. When he turned to crime, it was not from greed, but from desperation. Thomas watched Jack read, his young face reflecting the same confusion and moral uncertainty that had driven him back to the canyon. "Keep reading," he urged. "It gets more complicated. I spoke to many of Jack's victims during my investigation. While none excused his crimes, several admitted he had shown them unexpected mercy. The widow Santos told me he left money to replace what he had taken when he learned of her husband's death. The banker Morrison said Jack returned a family Bible that held no monetary value, but meant everything to Morrison's children." Jack remembered both incidents clearly. They had been moments when his conscience had overwhelmed his anger, when some remnant of the man he had been before tragedy struck had asserted itself. These are not the actions of a hardened criminal, Thomas. They suggest a man wrestling with his own conscience, trying to maintain some shred of honor, even as he pursued a dishonorable path. In my final years, I have come to believe that Red Jack Hollister was not evil. He was broken, and perhaps, given different circumstances, he might have found his way back to righteousness. The letter's conclusion hit Jack like a physical blow. If you ever encounter this man in your career as a ranger, remember that justice is not always about punishment. Sometimes it is about redemption. Sometimes the greatest service we can provide is not to capture a criminal, but to help a lost soul find his way home. Jack lowered the letter with hands that shook visibly now. The words blurred before his eyes as 20 years of carefully contained emotion threatened to overwhelm him. Marcus Brennan, the man he had feared and hated, had somehow understood him better than he understood himself. "My father never gave up believing that people could change," Thomas said quietly. "Even the worst people, if they were given the chance." Jack looked up to find Thomas studying him with new intensity. The young ranger's expression held a mixture of suspicion, hope, and something that might have been recognition. "That's a remarkable letter," Jack managed. Your father was a wise man. He was also a careful observer, Thomas replied. He trained me to notice details, to see patterns that others might miss. The conversation was heading toward dangerous territory, but Jack found himself unable to retreat. Something in Thomas's manner suggested that the time for deception was ending. What kind of details? Jack asked. Thomas reached into his other saddlebag and withdrew a small object that made Jack's blood turn to ice. It was a piece of metal, tarnished with age but still recognizable. A silver spur bearing the distinctive J.H. initials that had been Red Jack's trademark. Found this near where we were caught in the flood, Thomas said. Took me a while to place where I'd seen that marking before. It's in my father's old case files, described as part of Red Jack Hollister's personal effects. Jack stared at the spur, his mind racing through possible explanations. But the truth was inescapable. He had lost that spur during the rescue, torn from his boot by the rushing water. It was concrete evidence linking him to his criminal past. There could be any number of explanations for that, Jack said, but his voice lacked conviction. Could be, Thomas agreed. But then I started thinking about other details. The way you move, like Sam noticed. The scars on your hands that look like old gunshot wounds. The fact that you know this country better than any hermit should. The chess set carved with the skill of a man who's had years of enforced idleness. Each observation felt like another nail in his coffin. Jack had been so careful for 20 years, but 14 days of close contact had revealed more than he had realized. Most telling of all, Thomas continued, is the way you talked about justice, about systems that fail good people. You spoke with the passion of someone who's lived that failure, not just observed it. Jack met the young ranger's gaze, seeing intelligence and compassion in equal measure. The moment had come, the reckoning he had feared and perhaps secretly longed for during 2 decades of exile. What are you asking me, Thomas? I'm asking if you're the man my father spent 5 years hunting. I'm asking if you're John Red Jack Hollister. The words hung in the desert air between them, heavy with the weight of 20 years of deception. Jack looked into the face of Marcus Brennan's son and saw not the hard judgment he had expected, but something that looked remarkably like hope. For 20 years, Jack had prepared for this moment, imagining it would come with violence and desperation. Instead, it arrived with the quiet intensity of a confession, delivered by a young man who carried his father's badge, but also his father's wisdom about the possibility of redemption. Yes, Jack said simply. I am. The admission seemed to echo off the canyon walls, carrying with it the weight of decades of hidden truth. Thomas nodded slowly, as if the confirmation brought relief rather than triumph. What happens now? Jack asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying the letter in his hands. When he looked up, his expression held a complexity that reminded Jack powerfully of his father. Now, Thomas said, we figure out what justice really means. The revelation of Jack's identity changed everything and nothing. He was still the same man who had saved their lives, still the gentle hermit who had carved chess pieces and whittled toys for his dog. But now Thomas knew that those same hands had once drawn a gun in anger, that the thoughtful man who quoted philosophy over campfires was also the outlaw who had terrorized the frontier for 5 years. They sat in the cave as shadows lengthened outside, the familiar space now charged with new meaning. Thomas held his father's letter like a talisman, reading and rereading passages that seemed to speak directly to their current situation. Samuel's going to be back tomorrow, Thomas said. When I didn't catch up with him, he said he'd come looking. Jack nodded, unsurprised. Samuel Hayes was too good a ranger to let his partner disappear without investigation. What will you tell him? I don't know. Thomas looked up from the letter, his young face etched with uncertainty. He's not going to understand this like I do. Sam sees the world in black and white, criminals and lawmen, guilty and innocent. He won't see the gray areas. Maybe he's right to see it that way, Jack said. Maybe it's simpler than we're making it, is it? Thomas challenged. You saved our lives. You've been living peacefully for 20 years. You're not the same man who robbed those stagecoaches. Jack was quiet for a moment, considering the question that had haunted him since his first conversation with the Rangers. I don't know if a man ever really changes, or if he just learns to live with who he's always been. My father thought people could change. He wrote about it in case files, talked about it at home. He believed that redemption was always possible, given the right circumstances. Your father also believed in justice, Jack pointed out. He would have arrested me if he'd found me. Maybe. Or maybe he would have done what I'm trying to figure out how to do right now. Thomas stood and walked to the cave entrance, staring out at the desert landscape that had sheltered Jack for 2 decades. The young ranger wore his uncertainty like an ill-fitting coat, uncomfortable with the moral ambiguity that experience would eventually teach him to accept. Tell me about it, Thomas said without turning around. Tell me how it started, how it ended. Help me understand. Jack had never told the complete story to anyone, had never tried to explain the chain of events that had transformed a grieving father into a notorious outlaw. But sitting here with Marcus Brennan's son, he found himself wanting to try. I owned a small ranch outside of Del Rio, Jack began. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. Built it with my own hands, stocked it with cattle I'd saved 5 years to buy. The memories came slowly at first, then in a rush that 20 years of suppression could no longer contain. Jack told Thomas about his wife, Elena, who had died bringing their daughter Sarah into the world. He spoke of the 5 perfect years he had spent raising Sarah alone, watching her grow from a helpless infant into a bright, curious child who filled his world with laughter. When the diphtheria came through, I did everything I could. Rode 3 days to bring a doctor back, but it was too late. Sarah died in my arms, and something inside me died with her. Thomas listened without interruption, his face reflecting the pain of Jack's memories. The young ranger had known loss. Every lawman did, but nothing approaching the devastation Jack described. The bank came calling 2 weeks after I buried her, Jack continued. Said I owed money on improvements I'd never agreed to, fees I'd never heard of. Turned out the banker had been doctoring books, stealing from depositors to cover his gambling debts. But he had the law on his side, and I was just a broken-down rancher with no family and no friends to speak for me. The injustice of it still burned, even after 20 years. Jack had lost everything, his land, his cattle, his home, to a corrupt system that protected the wealthy while crushing the vulnerable. I tried legal means first. Rode to the county seat, talked to judges and lawyers. They all had the same answer. The bank's paperwork was in order. My word against theirs wasn't worth much. And I should be grateful they weren't pressing charges for the balance I supposedly owed. So you turned to robbery, Thomas said. Not quite a question, not immediately. I tried to start over, took work where I could find it. But word travels fast in small communities. The bank made sure everyone knew I was a deadbeat, someone who didn't pay his debts. Doors that had been open to me closed. Work dried up. I was starving and winter was coming. Jack paused, remembering the desperation that had driven his first crime. It had been a stagecoach carrying money from the very bank that had stolen his ranch. Poetic justice that felt more like providence at the time. The first robbery was supposed to be the last, Jack said. Just enough to get me through the winter, maybe stake a claim somewhere new. But word got out that I'd done it clean. No one hurt, everyone treated with respect. Other men started seeking me out, men who'd been wronged by the same system that had crushed me. Within a year, Jack had assembled a gang of similarly aggrieved men. Farmers who'd lost their land to corrupt officials. Cowboys cheated out of wages by dishonest ranchers. Veterans ignored by the government they'd served. They called themselves regulators, dispensing their own version of justice to those who escaped legal consequences. We had rules, Jack said. Never hurt innocent people. Never take more than our victims could afford to lose. Always leave enough supplies for them to get home safe. We were outlaws, but we tried to be honorable ones. Until my father started hunting you, Thomas observed. Jack nodded. Marcus Brennan was different from the other lawmen. He couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be reasoned with. He just kept coming, getting closer every time. Eventually I realized that staying meant my men would get caught or killed because of me. The staged death had been Jack's Final act as Red Jack Hollister, a rockslide that buried enough evidence to convince the authorities that the notorious outlaw was finally dead. His gang had scattered, some going straight, others drifting toward more violent pursuits. Jack himself had vanished into the anonymity of the Texas desert. 20 years, Thomas said when Jack finished his story. 20 years of living with what you'd done. 20 years of trying to figure out if I was a criminal who'd found justification for his crimes, or a victim who'd been driven to desperate measures, Jack corrected. I'm still not sure which is true. Thomas was quiet for a long time, processing the story and its implications. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the canyon walls in shades of fire. Soon Samuel would arrive, and the easy privacy of their conversation would end. There's something else, Thomas said finally. Something I found in my father's other papers. He withdrew another document from his saddlebags, an official-looking paper bearing the seal of the Texas Rangers. Jack recognized it immediately as an arrest warrant, though the specific charges were too far away for him to read. This is the original warrant for your arrest, Thomas explained, issued in 1854, signed by the territorial judge. But look at the bottom. Jack squinted at the faded ink, making out a notation in Marcus Brennan's careful handwriting. Crimes motivated by personal loss and systemic injustice. Recommend clemency consideration if suspect surrenders voluntarily and demonstrates genuine remorse. The notation was dated just 6 months before Brennan's death, recent, enough to suggest it represented the sheriff's final thoughts. On the case that had defined his career, he was going to recommend clemency. Jack asked, hardly believing what he was reading. More than that, I found correspondence with the territorial governor discussing the possibility of a pardon for Red Jack Hollister, conditional on voluntary surrender and restitution where possible. Jack stared at the young ranger, trying to process this information. Marcus Brennan, the man he had feared and fled from for 5 years, had spent his final months trying to find a way to offer redemption rather than retribution. He never gave up believing that you could be saved, Thomas said. Even when everyone else assumed you were dead, he kept working on your case. Not to capture you, but to find a way to bring you home. The irony was almost too much to bear. For 20 years, Jack had hidden from a man who had been trying to save him. For 20 years, he had lived in exile from a justice system that his greatest enemy had been trying to reform on his behalf. What does this mean? Jack asked. It means, Thomas said, standing and moving toward the cave entrance, where the sound of approaching hoofbeats could be heard, that we're about to find out whether my father's vision of justice can survive contact with reality. Samuel Hayes appeared at the canyon mouth, his weathered face grim with concern and suspicion. Behind him rode 2 other rangers, their presence transforming the intimate conversation into a formal confrontation. The time for quiet reflection was over. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Samuel Hayes dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent decades in the saddle, his sharp eyes immediately taking in the scene before him. Thomas stood near the cave entrance, his posture tense with the weight of knowledge he was not yet ready to share. Jack remained in the shadows of the cave mouth, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether he would live out his remaining years in peace or die at the end of a rope. "Thomas," Samuel called, his voice carrying the relief of a partner found safe and the suspicion of a lawman who sensed complications. "When you didn't catch up yesterday, I figured something had gone wrong." The 2 additional rangers flanked Samuel, younger, men who wore their badges with the eager confidence of those who had not yet learned to question the simple certainties of law and order. Jack recognized the type. He had been like them once, back when the world seemed divided cleanly between right and wrong. "Nothing's wrong, Sam," Thomas replied, but his voice carried undertones that his experienced partner immediately detected. "Then why are you here instead of heading back to headquarters?" Samuel's gaze shifted to Jack, and his hand instinctively moved closer to his gun. "And why does our friend John look like he's seen a ghost?" The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Jack could feel the weight of his past pressing down on him, 20 years of careful deception about to crumble under the scrutiny of trained lawmen. In his chest, something that might have been relief mingled with terror. From deep within the cave came a sound that changed everything. Boone's distinctive bark, followed by the scraping of claws on stone. The old dog emerged from the cave's depths, carrying something in his mouth, his tail wagging with the simple joy of greeting visitors. What he carried made Samuel's face go white with shock. It was a collar, old, weathered leather bearing a brass nameplate that had tarnished with age but was still clearly readable. Property of Red Jack Hollister. "Jesus Christ," one of the younger rangers whispered, his hand moving toward his weapon. Samuel's eyes locked with Jack's, and in that moment, 20 years of carefully maintained fiction collapsed into truth. The collar was evidence Jack had forgotten existed, a relic from Boone's early days that the dog had somehow preserved in the cave's hidden recesses. "Easy, boys," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of command. "Nobody moves unless I say so." Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between the rangers and Jack. "Sam, let me explain." "No need for explanation," Samuel interrupted, his weathered face set in grim lines. "I've been wondering for 2 weeks what was familiar about our host. Now I know. You're Red Jack Hollister, aren't you?" Jack emerged fully from the cave's shadow, his hands visible and empty. After 20 years of hiding, there was something almost liberating about standing in the open light of truth. "I am," he said simply. The admission hit the gathered rangers like a physical blow. The younger men tensed, clearly ready to draw their weapons, but Samuel's raised hand held them in check. The veteran ranger studied Jack with the careful attention of a man reassessing everything he thought he knew. "You saved our lives," Samuel said, the words emerging slowly, as if he were testing their weight. "You're the most wanted outlaw in 3 territories, and you saved the lives of 2 Texas Rangers." "I saved 2 men who were drowning," Jack corrected. "I didn't know they were Rangers until after, but you kept us alive after you knew," Thomas added urgently. "You cared for us, treated our wounds, shared your food and shelter." "That has to count for something." Samuel's laugh was bitter. "Count for what? You think kindness erases 20 years of robbery and violence?" "I think," Thomas said, his voice gaining strength, "that it shows he's not the same man who committed those crimes." From his vest, Thomas withdrew his father's letter and the amended arrest warrant. "My father spent his final years working on Red Jack's case, Sam, not to capture him, but to find a way to offer redemption." Samuel took the documents with obvious reluctance, his expression darkening as he read Marcus Brennan's words. The other rangers watched the exchange with growing confusion, clearly uncertain about how to proceed in a situation their training had never addressed. "Marcus Brennan was a good man and a fine ranger," Samuel said when he finished reading. "But he's been dead for 2 years, and the law is still the law. This man is a wanted criminal, and it's our duty to bring him in, for crimes committed over 20 years ago by a man destroyed by grief and injustice," Thomas argued. "Look at him, Sam. Look at how he's lived since then. Peacefully alone, harming no one. Doesn't that suggest he's found a better path?" Jack watched the argument unfold with a strange sense of detachment. These good men were debating his fate with the passion of philosophers discussing abstract principles. But he knew that the decision would ultimately come down to duty versus mercy, and duty almost always won. "There's something else you need to know," Jack said quietly, causing all eyes to turn toward him. "Something that might change how you see this situation." He walked to the wooden chest where his most precious possessions lay hidden, aware that every ranger's hand was ready to draw. With deliberate slowness, he withdrew a small object wrapped in faded cloth. When he unwrapped it, the gathered lawmen saw a child's wooden toy horse, carved with infinite care and worn smooth by countless small hands. It was clearly very old, clearly very precious, and clearly out of place in an outlaw's hideout. "This belonged to my daughter," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah. She died when she was 5 years old." and I've carried this with me every day since. The toy horse seemed to transform the entire dynamic of the confrontation, introducing an element of profound human loss that no amount of legal training could address. The wooden toy horse seemed to cast a spell over the assembled rangers, its simple presence transforming an arrest into something far more complex. Samuel stared at the carved figure, his weathered face reflecting the internal struggle between duty and humanity that defined the best lawman. "My daughter loved horses," Jack continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "Used to make me carry her around the ranch on my shoulders, pretending she was riding the wind. When she got sick, this little horse was the only thing that brought her comfort." One of the younger rangers shifted uncomfortably, clearly affected by the display of grief that had driven a man to desperate acts. The other maintained his rigid posture, but his hand had moved away from his gun. "That's a tragic story," Samuel said carefully, "but it doesn't change what you did afterward." "How many people did you rob? How many lives did you disrupt?" 17 robberies over 5 years, Jack replied without hesitation. "No one killed, no one permanently injured. Total amount stolen was approximately $8,000, most of it from banks and large ranches that could afford the loss." The precision of his accounting surprised the rangers. Most criminals tried to minimize their crimes or claim they couldn't remember details. Jack's honest assessment suggested a man who had lived with his actions rather than trying to forget them. "You remember every job," Samuel observed. "I remember every face. Every frightened voice, every family I hurt by taking what wasn't mine." Jack looked directly at Samuel, his eyes reflecting 20 years of accumulated regret. "You think I haven't paid for what I did? You think 20 years of exile, 20 years of living with what I became, hasn't been punishment enough?" Thomas stepped forward, his father's documents still clutched in his hand. "Sam, this is exactly what my father was talking about. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about understanding, about finding a way forward that serves everyone." "The law doesn't recognize degrees of remorse," Samuel replied, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "A crime is a crime, regardless of the criminal's feelings about it afterward." "Then what about mercy?" Thomas challenged. "What about the fact that he saved our lives? What about 20 years of peaceful living?" The debate was interrupted by an unexpected voice, one of the younger rangers, who had been listening with growing agitation, with respect. "Ranger Hayes," the young man said, "but this is Red Jack Hollister. My grandfather was one of his victims, lost a month's cattle profits to his gang back in '56. Jack turned to study the young ranger, seeing in his face the same combination of righteousness and inexperience that he had once possessed. "What was your grandfather's name, son?" "William Morrison. Ran a small operation near Uvalde." Jack nodded slowly, memory providing details with painful clarity. "The Rockingham Ranch. I remember him, decent man. Treated his hands fairly. We took $400 from a cattle sale he was bringing back from San Antonio." "Damn right you did," the young ranger said, his voice rising with anger. "Nearly broke him. Had to sell half his herd to make up the difference." "I know," Jack said quietly. "That's why I went back 3 days later and left $500 in his barn, along with a note explaining that the extra 100 was for his trouble." The young ranger's face went pale. "You what?" "Your grandfather never reported it, because he was afraid it would make him look like he was in league with outlaws. But I couldn't let a good man suffer for my mistakes." Jack's voice carried the weight of absolute truth. "Check his old papers if you don't believe me. The note was signed with my initials." Samuel looked between Jack and the stunned young ranger, his expression shifting as he processed this new information. "You gave back more than you took?" "Not every time," Jack admitted, "but when I learned that someone couldn't afford what we'd taken, I tried to make it right. It wasn't much, but it was something." Thomas seized on this revelation. "Sam, this is what my father saw. This is why he thought redemption was possible. A man who goes back to help his victims isn't a hardened criminal. He's someone struggling with his conscience." The young ranger stared at Jack with new eyes. "My grandfather never told anyone about the money. He just said things worked out better than expected. We all thought. You thought Red Jack Hollister was a monster who destroyed lives without caring, Jack finished. Maybe I was in some ways, but I tried to be a monster with a conscience. Samuel holstered his weapon completely, the gesture carrying symbolic weight. This changes things, he said slowly. A man who makes restitution, who tries to repair the damage he's caused, that's not the behavior we're trained to expect from career criminals. The law still says he needs to face trial, the second young ranger pointed out. Though his voice lacked conviction, the law also allows for mitigating circumstances, Thomas replied. And Marcus Brennan's recommendation carries weight with the territorial governor. If we bring Jack in voluntarily, if he cooperates fully and continues making restitution where possible, there's a real chance for clemency. Jack looked around at the faces surrounding him, Samuel's weathered features showing new respect, Thomas's young face bright with hope. The younger rangers struggling with complicated emotions they had never expected to feel about a notorious outlaw. What would voluntary surrender mean? Jack asked. Samuel considered the question carefully. Trial in El Paso, probably. But with Thomas's testimony about the rescue, Marcus Brennan's recommendation, and evidence of your attempts at restitution, the charges might be reduced significantly. Prison time certainly, but not hanging. How much time? Hard to say. Could be anything from 5 years to life, depending on the judge and jury. Jack was quiet for a long moment, weighing 20 years of freedom against the possibility of legal redemption. Boone pressed against his leg, sensing his master's distress, and Jack reached down to scratch the old dog's ears. What happens to Boone if I surrender? The question caught everyone off guard. Samuel looked at the aging cattle dog, seeing not just an animal but a companion who had shared 2 decades of exile. I'd take care of him, Thomas said immediately. Make sure he's comfortable, make sure he's loved. He's 12 years old, Jack said. Probably doesn't have many years left. He's never been around other people much, just me and you boys these past few weeks. Then maybe, Samuel said slowly, we need to find a solution that takes care of both of you. The veteran ranger walked to the edge of the canyon, staring out at the vast Texas landscape while he thought. When he returned, his expression had shifted from lawman to problem solver. Here's what I propose, Samuel said. Jack Hollister died in that rock slide 20 years ago. But John the Hermit, who saved 2 rangers and has been living peacefully in this canyon, might be willing to relocate somewhere a little closer to civilization. Somewhere he could be useful to folks who need help. Thomas caught on immediately. There are settlements throughout this territory that could use an experienced man. Someone who knows the country, who can help with problems that don't require official law enforcement. You're talking about letting me go, Jack said, hardly believing what he was hearing. I'm talking about finding a way to serve justice that my father would recognize, Thomas replied. You've already served 20 years of exile. You've shown remorse, made restitution where possible, and proven you can live peacefully. Maybe it's time for Red Jack Hollister to stay buried, and for John the Hermit to find a new life. Jack looked around at the rangers, honest men who were choosing mercy over rigid adherence to law. It was more than he had dared hope for, more than he felt he deserved. There's one condition, Samuel added. If you ever go back to your old ways, if you ever hurt innocent people again, there won't be any second chances. We'll hunt you down and finish what Marcus Brennan started. Fair enough, Jack said. But I think you'll find that man died a long time ago. What's left is just someone trying to figure out how to live with what he's done. As the sun set over the canyon, painting the rocks in shades of fire and gold, 5 men and 1 old dog stood at the crossroads of justice and mercy, law and grace. The decision they had reached would echo through their lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. 6 months later, the town of Cedar Springs had grown accustomed to the quiet man who lived in the small cabin on the outskirts of their community. They knew him simply as John, a skilled carpenter and occasional guide who had appeared one day with excellent references from the Texas Rangers and an old cattle dog who never left his side. The townspeople appreciated John's work, furniture crafted with an artist's attention to detail, repairs completed with the patience of someone who understood that lasting solutions took time. Children were drawn to his workshop, fascinated by the carved animals that seemed to emerge from blocks of wood under his skilled hands. He always had time for their questions, though he rarely spoke about his past. Thomas Brennan visited on a crisp autumn morning, his ranger badge catching the sunlight as he dismounted in front of John's workshop. The young lawman had been promoted to sergeant following his exemplary report on the cattle rustling case, a report that mentioned saving a hermit's life, but said nothing about Red Jack Hollister. "John," Thomas called, finding the older man putting finishing touches on a rocking chair that would grace someone's front porch for generations. "Thomas." Jack looked up from his work with genuine pleasure. "Good to see you, son. How's the ranger business treating you?" "Can't complain. We wrapped up that rustling case, caught the whole gang about 50 miles south of here. Turns out they'd been operating out of an old mine shaft, just like you suggested." Jack nodded, satisfied that justice had been served without his direct involvement. His knowledge of the territory's hiding places had proven valuable to the Rangers on several occasions, shared through careful conversations that never required him to explain how he had acquired such detailed information about outlaw refugees. "Speaking of which," Thomas continued, "I brought you something." From his saddlebag, Thomas withdrew a small wooden cross, freshly carved and sanded smooth. "For your daughter," he said simply. "Thought it might be time." Jack accepted the cross with hands that trembled slightly. For 20 years, he had marked Sarah's anniversary in private, with nothing but his memories and his guilt for company. The idea of a physical memorial, something that acknowledged her brief life and his enduring love, had never occurred to him. "There's a nice spot on the hill behind your cabin," Thomas suggested. "Peaceful place, with a view of the mountains. I could help you plant it if you'd like." Together they climbed the gentle slope behind Jack's home, Boone following at a pace dictated by his aging joints. The old dog had adapted well to their new life, though he still preferred Jack's company to anyone else's. The townspeople had grown fond of him, and several families had standing invitations for Boone to visit when Jack was away on business. The spot Thomas had chosen was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by oak trees, with a vista that stretched to the distant peaks. Jack knelt to plant the cross while Thomas held it steady, both men working in comfortable silence. "Sarah would have liked this place," Jack said when they finished. "She always loved being up high, where she could see forever." "Tell me about her," Thomas requested, settling on a fallen log that would serve as an informal bench. For the first time in 20 years, Jack found himself sharing happy memories of his daughter without the crushing weight of guilt that usually accompanied thoughts of her. He told Thomas about Sarah's laughter, her curiosity about everything from butterfly wings to distant stars, her habit of falling asleep in his arms while he read to her from his few precious books. "She made me want to be better than I was," Jack concluded. "After she died, I forgot that lesson for a while. Took me 20 years to remember it, and now—" Jack considered the question, looking out over the peaceful valley where he had found something approaching redemption. "Now I try to be the man she thought I was when she was alive. It's not always easy, but it's better than the alternative." They sat in companionable silence as the sun traced its arc across the autumn sky. Below them, the town of Cedar Springs went about its daily business, children playing in dusty streets, shopkeepers tending their stores, families gathering for the evening meal. It was the kind of ordinary, peaceful life that Jack had once thought lost to him forever. "Samuel sends his regards," Thomas said eventually. "He's been assigned to the Northern District, chasing down a gang of horse thieves. Says to tell you that your suggestions about their likely routes proved accurate." "Sam's a good man," Jack replied. "He could have made things difficult for all of us. He said something interesting the other day. Said that sometimes the best law enforcement isn't about catching criminals. It's about helping people find better ways to live." Jack smiled at that. Samuel Hayes had indeed learned something during their strange encounter in the canyon. though the veteran ranger would probably never admit to going soft in his old age. As evening approached and Thomas prepared to leave, Jack walked him back to his horse. The young ranger had filled out in the month since their first meeting, his face showing the confidence that came from making difficult decisions and living with their consequences. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked as he mounted up. Jack thought about the question seriously, as he did all important matters these days. "About my past? Plenty. About the choice we made that day in the canyon? None at all. My father would have been proud," Thomas said. "Of all of us." After Thomas rode away, Jack sat on his front porch as darkness fell over Cedar Springs. Boone curled up at his feet, content in the way that only old dogs can be when they know they are home. In the distance, lights began to twinkle in windows throughout the town, families gathering for supper, children being tucked into bed, people living the quiet lives that Jack had once thought beyond his reach. He reached for the journal he still kept, though its pages now recorded simple observations rather than the tortured thoughts of a man in exile. "Tonight," he wrote, "a man's past may be fixed, but his future remains unwritten. Grace, when it comes, arrives not as erasure of what was, but as possibility for what might yet be." Below in the town, a church bell tolled the hour, its bronze voice carrying across the valley like a benediction. Jack closed his journal and went inside, where the warmth of home waited for a man who had finally learned the difference between hiding from justice and finding peace.